All right, welcome to Bayou Time. And we've been talking about appropriations and Terrebonne and Lafourche in our general area, St. Mary. And we've been talking about over the years. And I got to brag a little bit. I've been here 40 years. And I got to tell you, this delegation that we have in Baton Rouge, and I'm holding up print that I can barely read and it's blown up, but it's good print. Because when you look at the numbers that we've received here in Terrebonne, in Lafourche, and St. Mary, and Assumption, just this general viewing area of HTV, it's incredible. Part of that success, we have a very key person on the Appropriations Committee. He actually chairs that committee. Jerome Zeringue is my guest today. He's a state representative, District 52. Good to see you, Jerome.
Good to see you, Moore, and thanks for having me.
Or Z, like
Z,
we all
yes.
call you.
That's right.
Like
That'd
most
be fine.
people know you. And, we talk so much and a lot of this is semantics. But when you have a year like we saw come through, I remember covering Gordy when he was in the same seat, and he had tremendous numbers. That delegation had tremendous number. But when a delegation comes back and surpasses per capita everyone in the state, and when you look at New Orleans, used to get most of the pie. This is tremendous what this area has received. So first of all, congratulations.
Well, thank you. And thank you. And like you said, the credit goes to the delegation, the hard work. We work together and try as best we can to identify what the critical priorities are and get them funded. And we work together with the Speaker and also members of the Senate. I mean, having key members in the Senate and, Senator Allen and Mike on the other side and our delegation working so hard, and Tanner as pro tem definitely helps and facilitates that process. But there is no doubt this year was a banner year in terms of providing funding for critical projects to this region.
And before we actually start calling out some of the projects, before you were elected, and I'll say it again, it was one of the cleanest races I've ever seen in politics, and amen for that, because I think we need more of that. But it was a pleasure to cover you and JJ in this race.
Mm-hmm.
And you were the victor, and you moved up, and you did a tremendous job. But you sort of knew where the halls were and where the bathrooms were and where everything was, because you were no stranger to Baton Rouge.
No, I wasn't. And it goes all the way back to when I was at LSU. I worked in the clerk of the houses. So I worked many sessions on the floor, working with the clerk's office and helping provide the information to the legislators, the bills. And back in those days, I'm dating myself, but they didn't have computers. So you had to collate the bills. You had to, every day, you had to put the book together, the bills. You've seen there on any particular day, we debate hundreds of bills. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it just depends on certain days. And those books had to be collated. And so it goes back to when I was at LSU, but even post that, after graduate school, working for LSU, working with Mike Voisin. Remember Mike Voisin? We'd go up to D.C. That's where I first started working with Garrett and advocating for the oyster industry and also on the state level. And then from that, working for the Terrebonne Levee and Conservation District, which primarily is advocating for and working to try to get money. And it was much different back then. But before we had the sales tax, we passed the sales tax, which was critical. But it's much easier when you have money, I can promise you.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah.
How much did you learn? In this first segment, we'll just talk a little bit to give people an idea of why y'all have been so successful. But you mentioned Mike Voisin. But you were working, I guess, back then when Senator Chabert was there. Was it Leonard Chabert in office, or was Marty in there at the time?
It was Senator Leonard Chabert was in there, but it was when he was getting ill, and there's no doubt that he had to slow down a bit. So it was from that point, but mostly when I was there, when I was at LSU, it was primarily Marty at that time.
So you got to see the way it worked. And you mentioned Mike Voisin. I don't know if there's ever was a more polished guy to get in front of a group and never raise his voice, just be constant, just be steady, and deliver the message.
Oh, he was a prince of a fellow. And one of the things, the biggest loss when he left was the impact to the oyster industry. He would in Washington, the East Coast, West Coast, he had utmost respect by the industry, but also had the ability to convey the critical issues. That's when they had the Volnificus issue, when the federal government wanted to shut the oyster industry down. But because of the efforts of Mike and the Gulf Oyster Industry Council, we were able to, even within those regulations, make sure that the industry could not only survive and prosper. It was a huge loss to the industry when he passed away, and they still feel it, and it's unfortunate, but he was a good man. Really good
A lot
man.
of people learn from it. What about a minute left to this segment? You're sort of tasked with, in the Appropriations Committee, let's not kid ourselves, that's a bomb of a committee. Everybody goes through that, and you must know everybody in the state at this point, but you're trying to be fair, but at the same point, you want to bring the bacon home. That's your job, you know?
Well, that's the job, but it's also funding critical priorities. Again, it's important. I do represent the district, but we do represent the state, and there are critical priorities. And you're right. I don't know everybody in the state, but everybody's asking for money.
They
come across the desk sooner or later. But we try to be fair and impartial, but working with the delegation and working with other members and in the Senate to ensure that we're addressing, and I think this year, and we can talk on some of the specifics in regard to critical infrastructure needs. We paid down debt, more money for higher education and education, and we can talk specifics, but I think this year we were able to address many critical issues. And yes, we were able to bring some money home, but we're able to address critical issues.
All right, so let's talk money, because per capita, y'all brought home more money than anybody in the state. Great delegation, great commitment to getting the job done. What are you most proud of?
Well, there are a lot of things that we were able to accomplish in terms of getting money from the state level. Proudest of the fact that we've made the most significant commitment to higher education that have been made in several decades. We've made major impacts in terms of addressing critical infrastructure needs, the Mississippi River Bridge, the Calcasieu Bridge, in our region, I-49 South, making sure that's important, and also looking at some of the things in terms of the preservation roads, which are roads that are off the state system. We're able to put $150 million in the roads that typically don't get much attention, and those are, for the most part, for some people, especially in rural areas, and here in Terrebonne Parish, are just as critical as the other areas. But I think one of the biggest things that we're able to accomplish, in addition to all the good money for infrastructure, was the fact that we made substantial investments in the future by paying down debt. Mm-hmm. We got the unemployment insurance back on track and to where it's not going to impose penalties for employees and employees. We paid down the unfunded the UAL, the unfunded accrued liability, which is the retirement system, put a significant contribution to that. In addition to the rainy day fund, the rainy day fund now is a little over $700 million, which is important. And if you think back when we first started our first term 6 years ago, we had a $2 billion deficit, and that we had to tap into. Unfortunately, you do everything. We had to, unfortunately, raise some taxes so that, I mean, the whole thing was Chabert was going to close, Nichols was going to close. I mean, they had no other alternatives.
I remember those days.
It was terrible.
Dark days.
Yeah, it's $2 billion deficit, of which we had to address the funding for the state and the point being is we had to tap into the rainy day fund when that's what it's for. Mm-hmm. But we reduced that to less than $200 million. Now we've built that back up to over $700 million, and that's going to help because we're anticipating, again, that those taxes were limited, and in 2025, that quarter-cent sales tax is going to roll off, in addition to some legislation that was passed that's going to rededicate funds from the general fund that is collected. It's off the sales tax of automobiles. It goes into the general fund. Well, now it's going to be redirected to infrastructure needs, roads and bridges, and that's another $450 for the general fund. So that what the point being is that within 2 to 3 years, we're going to have an $800 million hole that we're going to have to fix. And if the economy doesn't improve or we don't find a way to offset that, then there's going to have to be programs cut.
But you mentioned it, but it does take a team. You could be the appropriations chair, and if the governor doesn't buy into some of the things y'all are doing, there's going to be some squabbling. We all know that. But in the end, you all have to have a plan. How's that work for you?
Well, the plan is essentially in the House, all the fiscal measures have to be generated in the House. So we start having our plan, generating our plan uh, early in the beginning of the year. So the executive budget comes out typically in February, but I'm meeting with the speaker and we're meeting with leadership, in January in preparation for that. And then when the executive budget comes out, that's just a suggestion of the governor how he'd like to spend that funding.
Right.
Then we start having appropriations committee hearings, and we have hearings several weeks before the legislation even meets or convenes. So we're in the process of establishing what that plan is and what the budget would look like based upon the Revenue Estimating Conference numbers. As you know, every year, the Revenue Estimating Conference typically comes back and says, okay, guys, based upon projected revenue from sales tax, taxes, personal income taxes, and other things, fees and other services from the state, we anticipate that the state will have so much, $10 billion to spend. So then the budget is based on that. And then either if projections are that we won't have that money, we have to cut, or if we do have, we start allocating what those priorities are. So based upon the numbers and the projections of what the budget will be, that's when the plan really essentially gets started.
What are some of the things, with about 2 minutes left to this segment, that y'all were able to fund that people sort of forgot about over the years? Anything come to mind on that?
In the region, I think some of the things that we were able to accomplish, putting additional dollars to Terrebonne Sports Complex, which are important. That, another additional $2 million. Worked with Jonathan on the with the Rougarou Festival and the Wetlands Center that they're working on out there, trying to finalize and get the money for those little things, which
quality of life things.
Yeah, on the grand scheme of things, aren't totally much, but have a significant impact and make a difference. And so there are things, obviously, we put significant dollars to Morganza, to the Gulf. We put significant dollars to pump stations here in Terrebonne Parish and some of the roads, and working with the parish and administration and working with Gordy. And Gordy is great. And before session, we identify priorities and we work to address those needs, the parish's needs as well.
But pump stations weren't, I guess you knew so much about pump stations, having gone through it. Probably an easy conversation between you and Gordy at this point.
Oh, it is. And having worked with Gordy, again, I was as head of the CPRA when he was in this position. Mm-hmm. I was up in the state and working with Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is a priority for him. So we've worked together on these issues for a long time. So yes, it's pretty seamless.
Y'all speak the same language.
We do.
To poke a little fun, I remember being on this desk years ago and I was young and all these older reps and older senators. Now I get to interview somebody younger than me.
Not
cool.
Much younger, though.
It's cool, though. It
Not
really
much
is.
Younger.
All right, so David Rabelais on the Port Commission, you hear him talking about the ship channel quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all been able to do some things there.
Yeah, the important thing about the ship channel is finally the federal government and others. Well, we're using some of the dollars, HSRIS dollars, but also some of the BP dollars to put the structure in the lock structure. But the lock structure is only so good as the channel to provide the access. So the channel will be built, the lock will be built to a certain depth of -23, but if the channel isn't to the proper depth, it doesn't serve anybody any good. So the critical thing is that hopefully the lock structure will be completed within 2 to 3 years. So we were able to secure, the delegation was able to secure $40 million over a 2-year period to lower the pipelines, because the most expensive aspect about deepening the channel is relocating the pipeline. So it's going to take on the order of about $40 million, and that will allow for the pipelines to be relocated so they can dredge the channel, which will be at the same depth as the structure, which is going to improve not only the channel itself, but also opportunities for the port and businesses in and around.
You mentioned a figure earlier, but how much money coming this general way from the budget?
From the budget total, in looking at it, again, the budget it's somewhat complicated, not to get too far in the weeds, but there's different priorities of funding in terms of you put the project in there and it gets a certain priority. It doesn't necessarily give you cash, but it puts you in the queue for the next following year.
So in the queue.
So in the queue for Terrebonne Parish, we have in priority 5, we have $192 million in the queue. Now, this year for priority 5, what was priority 5 last year that went to priority 1 for funding, was over 52 million in Terrebonne Parish, and then we had priority 2, which is straight cash,
Right.
cash money, and we had over $6 million that came specifically for that. So for this particular year, just in the projects, that's not counting supplemental and everything else, we had over close to $60 million for projects and infrastructure. But we also had with supplemental and looking at what we put for LUMCON and some of the pump stations and roads, an additional $30 million. And that's not counting Lafourche and Nichols and all the additional dollars we have. So easily in the region, that money for projects is approximately $100 million in this region.
Not a bad year.
Yeah, it's a good year.
Let me ask you this, because probably quite a few people think that y'all could fund anything. And that's not really true. So I want to give you the floor a little bit, because if there's something that's federally mandated or there are federal rules on it, makes it difficult for y'all to get involved, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And you also look at the limitations. That's why we talked about the budgeting of state government. It's antiquated, it's bureaucratic, it's bloated, it needs to change. And we've done some things. We've passed some legislation to reduce the tax burden. But part of the problem is if you look at the overall budget, which is approximately $40 billion, of which little over 20 billion is from federal dollars, which require a state match. So of the state, when you talk about state dollars in fees that are generated, personal income tax, sales tax that we generate on the state level is right around $10 billion. After we have to pay our state match requirements to bring down federal dollars, transportation trust fund dollars, the things that we're required to match and fund, of that 10 billion, we basically have about 4 billion to say grace over. And of those things are limited to higher education, healthcare that you typically have to cut. So we do need to change that, and we're working on basically changing that. But yes, we are limited and we are hamstrung to a certain degree in how we can affect things within the overall budget. But we can't fund everything, obviously,
Right.
because when you look at, and that's the other thing about the calls I get, of the request of the funding, there are twice as much in terms of requests that is not funded or not capable of being funded than what we actually fund each fiscal year.
Yeah, and it's an education process for people, because most people think government can fund anything, but on the state level, there are rules.
There are rules and requirements and limitations.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. We got about a minute and a half left. Who calls you the most? You know, I got to
depends.
have a little fun with
Yeah,
you.
there's certain categories when it comes to
Besides your wife.
yeah, well, she calls. Unfortunately, I don't get to see her that much when we're in session.
Yeah.
But I think from the education perspective, Dr. Clune and all the others they call from, and it's great. I like we need to hear from them. But I think a lot of the times we hear from Reggie. I'd say Gordy calls me about the most in terms of.
I was going to say, I put my
projects.
money on Gordy.
Yeah. I think if I had to say in terms of you look at the fee bill or at least the call log, it would probably be Gordy with good reason. I mean, you understand he's advocating again for his region as well.
Sure.
So I think collectively, from the education perspective, it's in and around Nichols, but also the hospitals. And primarily, most of the calls are in and around from K through 12 education or higher education, and most of the calls that we get.
And real quick, not to mention the other legislators that want their piece of the pie.
Yes, that's all part of the process because, again, everybody has priorities in their region. And, again, it's easy to you can't just focus on the state, your particular region. Mm-hmm. Although you do, you have to look at it from a perspective of we have to look at what's in the best interest of the state. Well, say it again.
You don't know everybody, but they know you. You got the purse strings. But congratulations on a great job. Congratulations on the move up in your career. And continue to do great things for the area. And we appreciate you joining us on Bayou Time.
Well, thank you, Morton. I appreciate that. And then credit to the delegation. They really work hard.
All right. There you have it. Jerome Zeringue. We'll take a break. A lot more. Don't go away.